afternoon. Here we are, engineers and architects of Hawaii, in a joint session of both Zoom and physical presence in Topa Towers. Enjoying pizza and looking forward to an excellent presentation of a item that you may have seen if you're ever going down Ala Moana Boulevard. It's the large ship at the Maritime Museum. And the speaker that will be introduced.
I'll do that.
By Mac. And then Mac, if you would, a little bit of levity.
A joke from our own Victor Russell. This country boy calls 911. Dispatcher says, "What's the emergency?" The old boy says, "My wife got attacked by a pit bull and she's really hurt bad. And I need someone to come up with an ambulance and pick her up and take her to the hospital." "Okay, sir, what's the address?" 4051 Eucalyptus Drive. Dispatcher says, "Can you spell that, sir?" Pause, and the country guy says, "I'll tell you what, I'll drag her over to Oak Street. You guys can pick her up there." The title of that joke was, "Can you spell eucalyptus?" But bougainvillea would work just as well. Hans van Tilburg, NOAA Maritime Heritage Coordinator, Pacific Islands Region, and member International Committee on Underwater Cultural Heritage. In between, he has dived the bowels of the earth, exploring water shipwrecks, daring to sail where the winds and tides do take him, always challenging the golden goddess, the sea. He has written books, taught university courses, been to UNESCO, that and much more. And they say he can even play the banjo. Let's welcome today ships. When ships were made of iron and men were made of steel, and the whole darn thing was run by steam.
Well, wow. Yeah, it's really nice to come back and be somewhere physically. Thank you for that and for the pizza. That's appreciated. Really, I just show up for the massive speaker honorarium. Did I not tell you guys? We'll discuss that later. But yeah, it's a pleasure to come and talk about this type of maritime history, Scottish shipbuilding. I never knew that I would be involved in something like this. And in fact, I never knew I would be doing something as intimidating as coming to a group of engineers and architects and talking about marine propulsion and shipbuilding. I'm a liberal arts major, so be gentle with me. But this has become one of my favorite topics because it involves ship construction and maritime history. And so to begin, of course, as you know, central to this era of iron-hulled vessels and ultimately the revolution in marine propulsion and steam is coal. And you know, the British Isles are an island sitting on top of a rock of coal. It makes perfect sense then that the center of shipbuilding for so long on the River Clyde is, you know, there in Scotland. The River Clyde led the world in shipbuilding. Over 30,000 vessels in 300 years from 250 yards. So they rightfully feel proud of that past. You know, America as a country, in our history, we were late to that game. We had Wisconsin. We had to cut down all those trees and places like that. Just kidding. So we continued the wonderful tradition of wooden shipbuilding longer than places like England and Great Britain. And in fact, our first iron-hulled ship that we built, that we point to as our first iron-hulled ship, came in pieces, prefabricated pieces from Scotland, and we just put them together in America. So little known secret, about the Dirigo in 1894.
Like those shirts that say assembled in.
It's assembled in the US, right? Queen Mary, though, if any of you have been to Long Beach or seen vessels like this, you know that it's an astounding, monumental feat of engineering to take something, you know, a city block long and turn it into a ship like that, 1,000 feet long, 10 million rivets, 45 tons of anchor chain. I mean, the specs go on and on about that. The impressive specifications of one of Scotland's maritime achievements.
And it wasn't modular like today. I mean, they started at one end and
Right.
built to the other end.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know how the Queen Mary is doing lately. I haven't been to Long Beach in a while, but I remember we did have a conference there in the past years ago, and it did rain pretty heavily, and there were a number of buckets in the aisles and gangways. So there is this. It's hard to maintain ships like this, steel ships, iron-hulled ships, in a marine environment. It takes a real specialty, and we'll talk about that. I first started getting the bug for engineering because of the maritime history, and not just the shipbuilding, but the transition from sail to steam, the rather fascinating transition, beginning very early on in the late 18th century. And this was Scottish-led. You may have heard of the Lunatics. Well, you guys are engineers and architects, so I'm sure you're familiar with the Lunatics, the group of engineers that met on the full moon to save the cost of having candles lighting your way to the meeting and discussing all these wonderful advancements, the Boulton and Watt steam engine, et cetera, and James Watt, the inventor of that engine. A single cylindered engine, pushing a walking beam up and down, turning one paddle shaft at PSIs like, you know, 3-4 PSI, you know, but so no surprise. And then I don't remember when it was, but as a young kid, I was watching the James Burke Connection series. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And he just made all these wonderful connections between science and engineering and history, and did them very fast, talked very fast. It was very exciting. And he had this question: what does Scotch have to do with the Queen Mary? And even as a young lad, I realized the crucial cultural importance of this question because he answered it. Steam navigation had its birth and infancy in Scottish waters because the Scottish distillers had experience with steam pressure and knew how much fuel at what PSIs to get, you know, what kind of product. So no surprise. And as my noted maritime history professor, Dr. Bill Still, used to tell us, these original engineers inventing these early marine propulsion, marine vessels, were tinkerers and innovators and generally failures, because everyone looked at this pursuit askance like, you've got to be crazy to put a burning furnace on a wooden vessel. Who would do that? And who could travel at those speeds anyway? That's dangerous in and of itself. But you can see that some of these early versions of steam vessels, single cylinder, low PSI, paddle wheels, the screw propeller that isn't even around yet, right? That comes later. Because this is what happens, and people knew this, that you put these burning boilers on wooden vessels and they're going to blow up. In fact, some of the early passenger vessels on rivers, people refused to board them, so the steam vessel would tow barges, and they'd all board the barges behind the burning vessel in front of them. Then the cinders would rain down on them as they were towed down the river. So that wasn't great either. And then there is the kind of the well-known progression to us now of single cylinder, double compound steam, triple compound steam that is Scottish-led, Scottish engineers-led in the mid-1800s into the late 1800s. Ultimately, with triple compound steam, using the inherent, energy and building larger cylinders to capture that, reducing pressure, you get to a platform that's efficient enough that the vessel can finally carry enough fuel to cross larger distances. And triple compound really achieves a level of efficiency like that. And this is why we all caught the steam bug, because we're maritime archaeologists in my field. One of the things we do, and we were diving on these things. A lot of times the wooden hull is gone, but the machinery is there. We had to figure out what is it we're looking at? What is this? This is not internal combustion. This is external combustion. And we had to become familiar with 19th century steam engineering. The Scotch boilers, that round boiler that achieved that efficiency for the triple compounds. We find them all over here in the Hawaiian Islands as well, from the plantation days. By now you can see we're up to about 180 PSI. That's really getting efficient. So, that was the fascination for us. That's why we had to dive into the engineering aspect of marine propulsion, because we're diving around and sometimes in and through these very large steam marine propulsion plants. Here's a triple compound engine with the camshaft, the piston rods, cylinders themselves, and a scatter site of, this is actually a Liberty ship up in the atolls, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, the Quartet, part of the Quartet wreck site. And we just had to figure out what we're looking at. I've got to tell you, it was pretty exciting. Sometimes the early wrecks we dove on, the walking beam engines with the one cylinder, that guys could stay on the top of the cylinder and ride it up and down. Those were like 18, 22 feet tall. So we were diving on this jungle gym, trying to figure it out and map it. And what I used to do here in Hawaii when I taught classes for UH is I'd take the undergrad students to the railway museum, the train museum out there in Eva, and have them sketch some machinery. And they'd stand around very comfortably and say, well, this is silly. I mean, you just measure this and you sketch this. What's the challenge? And then we take them to the wreck site underwater, where we'd have, 6 feet of surge and sand blowing around and zero visibility. Say, go ahead, mister, this is so easy. Try to figure out what we're looking at. That's why we became interested. And that's why we love movies like this. There's not a maritime historian or underwater archaeologist in the room who doesn't watch Steve McQueen in this movie, The Sand Pebbles, about the US Navy's Yangtze River patrol, when his character, Jake Holman, in the movie, goes in the engine room and introduces himself to the steam engine and says, "Hello, engine, I'm Jake Holman." We went nuts. Anyway, just a plug for the movie, The Sand Pebbles, and Steve McQueen. And Star Trek, I'm afraid. This is my generation. And now we understand why Scotty has to be a Scottish engineer. Montgomery Scott in the Star Trek world, supposedly born in Linlithgow, Scotland, in the year 2222. And there are other Scottish cities that take exception to that. He's a fictional character, right? Your Scottish cities really vying for, no, we are the birthplace of Montgomery Scott, these other cities. James Doohan, the actor, Irish, okay? So it's not, there's nothing to do with the real world. But that's why you have to have a Scottish engineer in a series like this. What does all this have to do with the Falls of Clyde then? She's a sailing vessel. She was a sailing vessel. Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, even vessels like this from the later 19th century are remarkable engineering feats and had steam on board, not for propulsion purposes, but for labor-saving purposes to work the ship. Anyway, a bit of recap about the service, the history, the life, so to speak, of Falls of Clyde. She was the first of the Falls line, built by a famous company on the River Clyde in Glasgow, launched in 1878, and served early years as a general British merchantman, tramping the world all over, moving all sorts of cargoes, bulk cargoes. By 1899, she's purchased as Matson Navigation as their flagship. And that Matson story, as we all know, is a wonderful kind of Swedish Hawaiian story from the young William Matson makes his way out here to the islands and begins the Matson line. In 1907, so she was, a Hawaiian registered vessel in her Matson days. In 1907, she was converted to a bulk oil tanker, and that means that there were 10 internal steel tanks set inside the iron hull. So, how about that for a complex galvanic corrosion potential in a marine environment in salt water? And by 1926, she's gone out of the bulk tanker service carrying products from agricultural products from Hawaii to the mainland to California, and then carrying oil, fuel oil, back to the Hawaiian Islands. That was the tanker service for her. And she becomes a floating fuel depot in Ketchikan, Alaska. I believe it was Ketchikan. So down-rigged, live on board, and just supplying the fishing fleets. By 1959, and now we're talking some 70, 80 years after her launch, you know, iron vessels do last a long time, but that's a pretty long time. She's going to be put out of use and possibly end up as a breakwater, possibly end up scuttled. There's an effort to save the ship as a museum ship, and a number of people here in Hawaii were involved, Bob Krause and others. A number, I think, people from San Francisco Maritime Museum were involved. Many people were involved, and it was difficult to raise the funds to actually do that. But by 1963, the funds were raised, and she is brought from Alaska to Honolulu under tow and restored, fully restored, 4-masted, full-rigged ship, and opened by Bishop Museum. In 1973, she's placed on the list for a National Register of Historic Places, which is a nice recognition. And by 1989, the list for a National Landmark, which is even a higher level of recognition. And the Falls of Clyde remains on the National Landmark list today as a landmark property. Now, she spent a number of years in Honolulu, a wonderful museum ship. We remember a lot of experiences on board her. By 2008, she had deteriorated to the point where she was closed by the museum, no more public access. And Bishop Museum, I think, just saw her as, you know, a costly liability. Certainly it is difficult to maintain ships like this. Had a marine assessor come in and evaluate the vessel. He wrote a report saying she's in, in immediate risk of sinking, and she should be towed out of the harbor and disposed. At that point, the Falls of Clyde, Friends of Falls of Clyde stepped up, believed that there was more life in the old vessel, purchased the vessel from Bishop Museum for $1 to Bishop Museum's credit and credit of Friends of Falls of Clyde, and has managed that for 8 years. Until 2016, when the efforts to restore or find a home for her hadn't paid off yet, Harbors Division revokes the mooring permit and claims the vessel. And there is another effort now to still save Falls of Clyde, because it's Falls of Clyde International. I'll mention them later on. There is steam on board. And there wasn't just an auxiliary boiler for the small donkey engine to operate the heavy yards and sails, because that's a labor-saving device very necessary for these big, heavy ships, which at a time when steam propulsion is claiming more of the commercial profit in the world, we kept reducing the number of crew to economize transportation services. But the boilers that were placed in the ship in 1907 were larger to operate the pumps for the tanks. There's a pump room with that machinery and boilers for that purpose, and there's one of them on board. Now, the point I want to make is there was no single transition at a time when people said, well, we see the obvious advantages of steam propulsion and getting home when we want to get home and not when the wind lets us get home. So the overlap is rather impressive. You can see in this graph on the right, really between 1860 and 1890, in white, the construction of steamships, but in black, the continued construction of sailing vessels. During this time when steam is becoming more and more economically feasible, that's because of still the sheer economics of operating a sailing vessel for the cargoes that don't need to be, there the next day, I guess, as we'd say these days. Bulk cargoes that can spend some time aboard. Maybe that's another way of putting it. Grain, lumber, guano and nitrate, salmon and lumber, coal, jute, copra. Examples of those bulk cargoes. So there's quite a period where both of these types of vessels were common and no one would have thought anything of it. If we saw a commercial sailing vessel, 3 or 4 masts coming in today operating commercially, we would say something about it. And that's too bad, because that's a pretty carbon neutral footprint after you construct the dang thing. As a historian, though, this is something that I really find interesting, that as these sailing vessels got larger and larger and more economically feasible and the crews got smaller and smaller, life at sea became more and more hazardous. Because in a nutshell, when you have a small wooden vessel like Cook's Endeavor and something breaks, the carpenters go ashore, find a tree, make a mast, and they fix the thing, and you go on your way. Or with the fiber, the textile, the organic lines, and a strong blow comes, the lines break, and the mast might give way, but the ship doesn't sink. But now with large iron-hulled ships and steel masts and wire rope holding those masts in place, those wires aren't going to break. Those ships will sink. Or the inability of these crews to maintain their vessels themselves, or even find a dockyard that could fix the ship to get home. There are very few that could actually service iron hulls at that time. So in fact, a lot of these vessels were more dangerous places to live, and that fact led to the formation of the sailors' unions, longshoremen and seamen's unions. Because a lot of these older sailing vessels, like the Falls, that stayed in service so long, became coffin ships. They'd be overinsured, the owners would send them out, knowing they'd possibly vanish. The sailors were wards of admiralty. They didn't have the vote, right? It was a very odd job. Anyway, the social side of the hazards at sea are quite an interesting topic. So here's the Falls, arriving in 1963, on her way to be fully restored and put on display a number of years later. And I've got to say, quite beautiful. There's the figurehead, the lay around the bowsprit, the 4 fully rigged masts, the only 4 rigged, tanker left in the world. So quite unique for our history and quite a wonderful platform for a number of years, for many of us here. The Welcome Home flyer, complimentary of Budweiser, music of the Sons of Hawaii. That sounds pretty good. $1 per cup, Budweiser on draft. I think they did it right. And just some of the memories of what used to be on board. Many of these things, when she was downrigged and no longer accessible, went into container storage and are still around. Some things, we don't know where they are anymore, but many of these features and artifacts, which are quite wonderful, are in a container and are trapped. Cabin house, the steering gear, picture of the cabin aft, identical. Next slide.
So does this have ropes in it?
It had a worm gear.
A worm gear?
Yeah, worm gear for turning the rudder post. Yep. And the interesting thing is that the helm, the position where you con this vessel, steer this vessel, you're behind the wheelhouse. You don't see forward at all. You don't really have to. You have a look up the bow. You're probably looking up at the sails, so you don't get taken aback, which is bad for a full rigged ship. But you don't have to be the one staring over at the bow all the time. Oh, wonderful shot, the galley and the galley stove. For a warm meal on a cold and stormy night. This is where it becomes from. So, what happens ultimately is as the vessel deteriorates, because I'm not aware that there ever was really a specific preservation plan for maintaining an iron-hulled vessel here under the Bishop Museum's care or the Hawaii Maritime Center's care, nor a specialized conservationist. This isn't something that anyone can really step into. You might know something about old wooden houses, but to maintain and restore an iron-hulled ship in a marine environment is quite a specialized craft. And there are just a few people in the world that still do it. We had many of them come out and consult with us in 2008 about this. We brought them in from Texas and San Francisco Maritime, San Diego Maritime. They all knew about the plight of the Falls of Clyde, and they all advised the Friends of Falls of Clyde on action plans and what could be done. But here she is, downrigged, figurehead gone, bowsprit gone, And the masts, which, are rigged together, can be brought down and put on deck. And actually it was done fairly often. You look at them, they look pretty permanent, but no, these things could be brought down by the sailors on the ship often with the steam gear and winches to handle the heavy steel yards. And just a couple of images, you can see how the rudder has, really deteriorated away into pieces. At the stern,
Was it wooden?
no, it was iron as well. And you can see how high she's riding out of the water because the ballast, the cargo tanks, which are now the ballast tanks with fresh water, are dewatered for the most part. So she's riding pretty high up. And you can see the masts and yards on the deck, stored on the deck. So, Friends of Falls of Clyde was a volunteer organization I joined for several years, and friends of mine are now still on the board, and they are still working actively to find the support to save the vessel. They no longer manage the ship directly, though. But in the days when we did, this stuff is fun. You got to say this stuff is just kind of fun, especially for historians who used to be in the building trades. You get to do stuff with power tools. Is it toxic? Sure, it's a little toxic. I mean, there's paints and rust and chipping, but hey, we took all the precautions that we needed to. And you can see the hatch cover here for one of the 10 cargo tanks. And we did, inspect those weekly to monitor the levels of those tanks, monitor the status of the ship. We knew that efforts that we were doing on deck were basically cosmetic, but more for our own morale and to keep the momentum going and interest going in working on the restoration effort, because the things the ship really needs, are beyond our grasp. There's shipyard. And it's nice to have your daughter join in this stuff sometimes. Get a little bit of experience, and you can say she's worked on a 4-masted, tall ship, but that was really special for me anyway. For her.
He's smiling at you.
Yeah. But you can see the condition of some of the, deck frames and deck beams below. These were the areas, between decks, which were exhibit spaces when she was open to the museum. And we had lighting, we had a pumping system set up that we could activate, but there were, voids and deteriorated sections of the deck, steel deck, which were hazardous and that we had to avoid. Above that cargo hatch, and he is one of those specialists in ship preservation. And so what we're doing is going down inside the tanks and conducting a close inspection of the structural members inside of the hull to write up an assessment and recommendation. And this took pretty careful work with, it's an enclosed space. And we were monitoring carbon dioxide levels and providing ventilation. And then we had a retrieval system or harnesses in case if you pass out in there, it's 3 or 4 stories up to that small hatch that we'd have to recover someone. We never had a problem like that. Now, this is a little detailed, but you might see how the red lines are laid out. And these are the port and starboard tanks, 5 on each side, 5 of those darker hatches on each side, so 10 tanks total. And that's the layout for the tanks. And then some of the assessment of the documentation that did exist on where the patches are, epoxy patches, concrete patches, because Bishop and the caretaker at the Hawaii Maritime Center for years did everything they could to take care of this vessel, although it didn't have the preservation plan or conservation expertise that it needed. But I will say this about historic landmark structures like this. There are some things that are difficult. There's one thing that was done at some point, we're not sure when. Concrete was poured in the bilges down at the bottom of the ship between the frames. And one of the general rules for preservation is, you have reversible techniques are used, but concrete's not one of them. So I don't think anyone could tell you what's happening between the lower hull and the concrete in the bilges of Falls of Clyde at all. Nor would that be easy to get out of the ship if she ever is restored. Here you can see the ventilation system, the ladder leading down, the numbers on the ladder. So they made it easier for the crew to monitor the levels of the cargo, the petroleum cargo. And it's 3 or 4 floors down into those hot spaces, steel boxes in the Hawaiian sun. Talk about rocks and shoals. I mean, we didn't even do anything wrong. And the condition of some of the elements in these tanks, some of the ladders, we had to be pretty careful going in there. Do I know that it's in bad shape compared to other ships? I mean, how many sailing tankers have I ever been in? So I don't really know. I couldn't tell you. I will say that in the, the expertise we brought in from San Diego and San Francisco and elsewhere, when they found their ships to be restored into the sailing vessels or museum ships, they were like, sometimes things are in much worse condition. You guys are fairly well off. That was back in 2008. They made some of those comments, but it wasn't that bad. You can see the level of the water too in the cargo tank. And that's an image of some of the structural elements, the stringers, the stanchions. And some places, have received more treatment than others and are looking fairly good. Now, the outside of hull was of interest too, because, nobody's regularly scraping the Falls of Clyde. So she's a reef. She's a floating reef. And I guess if there was a plan to take her elsewhere or to remove the incrustation, would there be some Endangered Species Act review we might have to go through? There are marine species and corals on the hulls of falls. We shouldn't be damaging corals in Hawaii. Well, okay, if we get to that point. But you can see the view of waterline now, the amount of incrustation here. It's hard to assess anything underwater. Though we did do a dive to see if we could understand the hogging that the vessel's undergoing. And you may be familiar with this. Sailing ships have a pointy end here and a pointy end there and a fat end in the middle. So the buoyancy that supports the hull is mostly in the middle and not at the end. So that means over time, especially for wooden vessels, bow and the stern drop. And that's an indication of the strength of the keelson and the keel condition of the ship. So we went under to see if we could tell what it was. And it was interesting diving on the hull. She is a reef. There are scallops, which are tasty. We didn't eat them, but can even be eaten underwater, sometimes if you're harvesting scallops. And coral as well. And here you can see the keel, the very rounded curve near the bow, closer to the bow. Amidships, the bottom would be flatter, would be darker image. This is closer to one of the ends. You can see some of the scallops there. Scallops. It's on the keel itself. There they are, a little bit opened up. Yeah. So this is a highly scientific, completely accurate keel line hogging measurement. I say that as a marine archaeologist, and your engineers, you can appreciate the expertise and scientific knowledge that went into this approach. We simply found a line that was neutrally buoyant underwater, attached it at each end, pulled it taut, and then we dove in between, and every 10 feet, we took a measurement up to the keel. And in the middle, we had about a foot. So that's about a foot of hogging. Drop. Is that good? Is that bad? Again, I don't know what the database is for hogging of older vessels like this, but it's not a good thing. And this is the final slide, just a bit about her status now. So, she was impounded by the state in 2016. The state did give the Friends group a number of years, to find a solution. And I believe the state wanted a solution to be found, but it's a difficult situation. It'll take a lot of money to restore or to preserve this vessel. So so here are the groups that are now actively engaged. The Friends group, of course, still is a 501c3, formed back in 2008. Falls of Clyde International was formed in 2016 at the time when the state impounded the vessel. This is a Scottish-based group, and actually a very strong initiative with some strong support from people in Scotland on the Clyde who want their vessel to come home. And they have quite a nice vision of restoring the ship to be a training facility of, zero carbon transportation to train, school kids. And they have the shipyards, and they have the expertise to do this kind of work. The difficulty is getting the vessel to Scotland. but she's not going to get there on her own, and she's not going to get there on a tow. And that means a large submersible barge, the kinds of things you see servicing oil platforms in the Gulf or picking up Navy ships and getting them. And that's millions of dollars, you know, to transport a vessel like that. So that's kind of the sticking point. And I believe there were arrangements, there were discussions going on. And at certain times there's been, you know, hope that that plan might have gone through, and then something fell through and it didn't. Anyway, by 2019, the state was looking for proposals, you know, put out a call for proposals to remove the vessel from the harbor anywhere, disposed, go somewhere to other harbor, just, you know, it's becoming a risk for the harbor in the opinion of the harbor's Department of Transportation, or the state folks. But there's still quite a lot of interest. Here's a June 2020 article on backing that the international crowd, you know, has raised. And there's quite a bit of communication, Facebook traffic, and ideas of what to do next. But I can't say that I'm familiar with what that path is right now. The board of the Friends group is still active, as well as the international group. And hopefully in the near future, she'll make it to Scotland, where people, you know, seem to have the capacity to take on this project, because I think that would be wonderful. Thanks. That concludes all the remarks. My remarks were not endorsed by the Department of Commerce nor NOAA as an agency. I'm representing myself as a private citizen.
Everybody can unmute and ask any questions if you want. We have a few minutes here. It's 1 o'clock. Hans, are you available for a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay, so if you want to stay on, we'll continue. But before we do that, we need to give a certificate of appreciation. Mac?
Mac, aye. This can go right next to your Sustained Superior Achievement Award from NOAA.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Our letter of appreciation.
I appreciate that. My pleasure.
Thank
really.
you.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay, you can bring it up a little bit closer so people see it. There we go. All right. Okay, any questions? We have 3 errands today. That's a record, I think. Any questions from people online?
Well, I would make a comment. When I was, all those years that I would see ships that were steam in it, and had a screw steam engine, they would also have sails. And there was a time when so many of the wooden sailing ships were sinking, disappearing, that they were hazards to navigation. So when you had a steamboat with one screw, it wasn't rare to hit a hulk somewhere, and now you have
A steamboat with no screw.
so don't give up your sail right away. So, but I guess we're safe from hulks at sea now.
How about a little bit on the transition from paddle to using screws and single? What made that transformation? Was it speed of being able to turn a shaft? Was it, what would be the parameters? Go ahead.
That's really an interesting question. Yeah, you know, paddle wheels, wonderful for hook fin, Mississippi River, smaller lakes, places you don't have ocean swells, because imagine, you know, the paddle wheel on the port and starboard side in a vessel that's pitching at sea and rolling at sea. This paddle is in, that paddle's out, this paddle's in, that paddle's out, and the torque that would put on the engine mounts, for one thing. And then in these longer passages, oceanic passages, where the poor steam engineer is trying to figure out how much coal you need to get where, as you use up your fuel, the vessel starts coming up in the water and the paddles aren't making contact. You're burning more of it. So that's got to be some crazy math. That's why I'm a liberal arts major. I couldn't take the math or the chemistry. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, the non-suitability of paddle wheels for ocean transportation. Not to say that we didn't have ocean steamliners with paddle wheels in the 1860s. We did, and they faced all those problems.
But Clyde didn't go through that transition. They started with the props.
Falls of Clyde?
Yes.
Pure sail. Pure
Is it-
sail.
Is its beginning and then.
Yeah, yeah. The military would have a different perspective on the transition from paddle wheels to steam, to screw propulsion. They would say you don't usually shoot away the screw. But those paddle wheels, they could be targeted pretty quickly. But interestingly enough, real quick, that's where the term bridge comes from. You go to the bridge because the early steamships had the paddle wheels, couldn't see forward, conning the vessel from the aft. So they built a bridge between the tops of the paddle wheels and put the wheel up there. You go up to the literal bridge to steer the ship. And then we just kept the word and we called it the bridge.
So is there any physical maintenance of the Falls of Clyde still happening, or is it just kind of sitting there?
I don't know if I could answer that. I know that I heard that recently there was, after a storm event, there was some leakage. And I think that the state having impounded the vessel, is responsible for maintaining that. I don't think that the Friends are the ones that maintain that anymore. So, I'm sure there needs to be at times, but I don't know who's doing what.
Could some form of just a new coating, something over the outside, or is it moisture in the air? What is the source of that kind of corrosion that you're having there? Is it biological in any sense?
Well, the biology actually puts a barrier between the oxygen in the electrolytic solution, the seawater, and the iron. So it can be a good thing, although there can be deterioration of iron in a non-aerobic environment also. But in terms of coatings, yeah, we heard some very interesting things from Ray Ashley, who's the director of San Diego Maritime Museum. And the new kinds of coatings that he uses, they've got the Balcaluta, right? No, that's in San Francisco. San Diego has Star of India, right? That there are coatings that bond with the iron in the hull. And once you put that coating on, it is kind of a wonderful one-shot deal. So there have been advancements in that. It's gone way beyond just the red lead, paints that we were putting on fiberglass boats for so long, way beyond that. But you'd have to clean the hull and repair the hull first, and that means dry dock. That means hauling her out.
Is the Pacific Shipbuilding International, that's not too far away, big enough to accommodate it if they were to take that as a mission?
I thought so, but again, it's going to take a while. I think that any shipyard would look at this saying, once you haul falls out, there's no telling if she's going back in or how long it's going to take. So it's pretty risky unless there's some serious capital up front to guarantee that we're not stuck with something taking up our yard that we're going to be losing a lot of money on. I think that might be a philosophy of any shipyard. So yeah, there's some pretty big considerations there.
How thick is the hull?
Oh, good question. Thank you so much for asking that one. I couldn't say. I want to say, 7/8 inch iron plate, but maybe not anymore in places.
I'm sure, yeah.
But I can't say I remember the specifics for that original thickness of the hull plate. Sorry. Good. This is going to be on the final exam, so I'm glad I saw everyone taking notes.
Thanks for putting all this together.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you again.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comments on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach. So please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.